The wind howled low across the Montana foothills, like a warning whispered through the pines. The sky was turning the color of burned molasses, streaked with gray smoke that hugged the earth instead of rising from it. Harlan Briggs sat alone. Inside his cabin, bent over the scarred wooden table where his hunting knife caught the firelight with each pull of the whetstone. His hands were steady, knuckles worn like old leather, wrists dusted with ash from the hearth. The only sound inside was the crackle of pine logs, dry and snapping, and the slow, rhythmic drag of metal against stone. He hadn't spoken aloud in 4 days. Hadn't needed to. The cattle stayed close to the lower pasture. The barn door was bolted tight, and no one from town came this far out without a reason. That was the way he liked it. Solitude was a sort of peace one he didn't deserve, but clung to anyway. When the knock came, it sounded wrong. It's too soft to be a ranch hand, too urgent to be a neighbor. It paused, then came again faster. Harlan stood slowly, his joints popping in protest. He set the knife down, gripped the rifle from its cradle near the door, and pulled it open. A gust of wind swirled ash into the room, and there she stood. She couldn't have been more than 25, though hardship had carved years into the hollows of her cheeks. Her hair was tangled and dusted with soot, eyes wild with desperation. A child no more than 6 months old clung to her shoulder, its cries sharp against the winter silence. Her dress was torn at the hem, barefoot feet purpled from the cold. Her hands trembled as she clutched the baby tighter to her chest. Behind her, smoke coiled in the valley like a dying thing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without stepping aside, Harlan said flatly, "Fire." She nodded once. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, it took everything. He could have asked more. Who was she? Where'd she come from? What was she running from if it wasn't just the fire? Instead, he looked past her, then down at the child, then back at her. Her hands were bleeding from where she'd fallen. One palm half blackened with a blister. The child's cheek was streaked with ash. Something old and broken inside Harlan shifted just a little. A memory, maybe, or a ghost. He stepped aside. She entered like a breath being held too long. Warmth of the fire hit her skin and made her knees buckle, but she didn't fall. She crouched near the hearth and unwrapped the child just enough to check his face. The baby whimpered but stopped crying. Harlan shut the door. She didn't sit, didn't speak. Just knelt their arms tight around her boy, rocking him softly. Harlan stood a few feet away, watching. Skin shimmered with sweat and soot, hair singed at the ends. Her dress, what was left of it, clung to her with damp ash. She looked like she'd walked straight out of a funeral pyre. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. She took it with a shaking hand, drank half, then touched the rest to the baby's lips. He fussed, but drank. Then she whispered, "Horse, thank you." Harlan turned back toward the table, toward the knife, but left it untouched. Instead, he opened the old cedar chest near the window and pulled out a wool blanket, worn but clean. He handed it to her, and she nodded, wrapping it around herself and the baby like a shield. Still no questions. None offered, none answered. Night deepened. Shadows moved across the log walls, firelight bending like it didn't want to touch her. She finally lay down beside the hearth, curled on the rug like a dog and from the cold. The baby, her boy, slept. Against her chest, his tiny fist was wrapped around a piece of her dress, holding it like a lifeline. Harlan sat in his chair across the room, watched, listened to the wind scrape against the window panes and the logs, creak as they settled. Outside, the cold pressed against the walls like it wanted in. But it wouldn't get her. Not tonight. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. In the flickering light, she looked like someone he'd once known, nor someone he'd tried to forget. He thought of Clara, of that last winter, of the child that never drew a breath, and the grave that still stood under the pine hill. Half covered now with snow, the baby stirred. A soft cry. She whispered something into his ear, and he quieted again. Harlan rubbed his face, calloused fingers, dragging down over his beard. The scent of ash was thick in the room, sharp, bitter. He would need to change the air tomorrow, patch the hole in the roof, gather more wood. But tonight, he kept watch, not out of kindness. Because someone had knocked, and he had answered. Morning came slow, like a reluctant guest. Pale light pushed its way through the frost-bitten window panes, casting a soft glow across the cabin's rough-hewn floorboards. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not heavy, not yet, just enough to dust the hills and soften the sharp lines of the pines. Martha sat near the fire, the baby nestled in her arms, wrapped tight in Harlan's old wool blanket. She rocked gently in the creaking chair, her eyes tracking Harlan through the window as he split logs in the yard. He moved with purpose, but not ease. His shoulders bore weight that had nothing to do with the axe in his hands. Each swing seemed part of a rhythm only he knew, steady, careful, deliberate. She noticed the way he paused before each cut, how he braced his stance like a man accustomed to blowback. There was caution in every movement, not just from the cold, but something deeper, something that had nothing to do with winter. Inside, the baby stirred, small fingers curling and uncurling in sleep. Martha touched his cheek, murmured nothing in particular, just a sound to keep the world away. Her own body ached, though she'd never say so. The bottoms of her feet were still raw. Her shoulder, where the baby had clung to her during the fire, was tender to the touch. But pain was a distant thing now. It had been replaced by vigilance. Out in the snow, Harlan paused and looked toward the hill. He could see it from the woodpile, the lone pine tree, still green, standing watch over the weather-worn stones. No names etched. He hadn't had the strength for that. Just a carved cross on one, and a bundle of dried wildflowers left at the other every spring. 2 winters ago, Clara had gone into labor too early. The midwife had ridden through the storm to get there in time, but time didn't care. The baby came fast, and Clara bled faster. She died before the sun came up. The baby had lived a few more hours, cradled in Harlan's arms by the fire, small and gasping like he didn't know how to breathe. Then he'd gone still. Harlan hadn't cried. Not that day. Not since. Instead, he buried them both by the tree she used to sit beneath when she sewed. And then he stopped speaking, stopped riding into town, stopped believing in warmth. The axe hit the stump one last time. Harlan stood still for a moment, breathing in the cold, then turned and walked back toward the cabin. When he stepped inside, he paused at the threshold, boots heavy with snow. Martha looked up from her chair, eyes unreadable. Wait. He set the wood beside the hearth, then moved to the stove. Without a word, he poured water into the blackened kettle and set it to boil. The silence wasn't cold. Not exactly. It was the kind that sat between two people like a third presence, not an enemy, but not a friend. Later, when the baby napped, Martha stood and began quietly moving through the room. She folded the extra linen stacked by the wall, smoothing each one with a careful palm. She picked up the broken latch from the rocking chair, and without asking, began working it loose with the tip of a hairpin. Harlan watched her from the table, but said nothing. She did not ask for permission. She just moved, slow and deliberate, as if the act of making order out of disorder might calm something inside her. At one point, she rolled up her sleeve, and Harlan saw the burned scar on her forearm. It ran along the inside, pale and raised like rope under her skin. Old, but not ancient. She caught him looking, but she didn't pull the sleeve back down. She let it show. Whatever fire she'd come from hadn't just burned land. It had marked her, claimed part of her. He thought of asking. Just one question, but it lodged in his throat like splinters. He knew better than to pull at scars. As dusk fell, she lit a candle and placed it by the window, for decoration. For someone who might be looking, perhaps, or maybe for someone she hoped would never find her. The baby, waking again, whimpered once before settling back against her chest. Harlan stepped outside to tend the animals. The sky was deepening into bruised blue, stars barely starting to prick through. Snow fell like feathers, slow, silent, and endless. When he returned, she had boiled a pot of beans and set a plate for him, without a word. The gesture wasn't warm, exactly. But it wasn't cold either. They ate in silence. Two souls occupying the same space. To ghosts with breath in their lungs and nowhere else to go. And somehow that felt like the beginning of something. Or maybe just the middle. Of something neither of them had chosen, but were living through anyway. The storm rolled in as the day died. First, the clouds thickened, bloated and gray like something heavy with memory. Then came the wind sharp, moaning through the trees and rattling the shutters like bony fingers. Snow began to fall fast and flat, flung sideways in gusts. The cabin walls creaked. The fire hissed when the draft found the hearth's throat inside. Harlan added another log and shut the iron grate. The baby coughed in his sleep, a wet sound that tugged at Martha's spine. She held him closer, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fire. One hand smoothing his hair while the other clutched the fraying corner of the wool blanket. She hummed softly. An old lullaby from farther east, from before something about sparrows in the corn. Her voice was barely more than breath, but it was steadier than the wind outside. Harlan moved like a shadow. Lighting the lantern by the door and checking the rifle near the window. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He felt something in the air, an unease that wasn't just weather. The kind of stillness animals sense before a predator comes near. Then the knock came, not soft like hers had been. This was hard, demanding, not a request, but a threat. 3 times, then a voice. Hoarse, sharp, soaked in liquor. Martha, she went still. The baby stirred, but didn't wake. Her eyes were wide. Fear did not pass across her face, it rooted. There, sudden and complete. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her fingers clutched the child tighter. Martha Reed, the voice barked again. I know you're in there. Harlan stepped to the door. He didn't ask. Didn't look to her for permission. Just grabbed the rifle and threw the bolt. He opened the door. The wind surged in like it had been waiting. Snow swept across the floorboards. And there he stood, a man, late 30s, maybe older, hard to tell through the grime and stubble. His coat was open at the collar, a rope slung over one shoulder, boots crusted with half-melted snow. He stank of sweat, old tobacco, and the kind of whiskey sold behind swinging saloon doors. His eyes were small, mean, and slick with something. Uglier than alcohol. He smiled when he saw Harlan. Ain't you gonna invite me in, friend? Harlan didn't answer. Just shifted the rifle up another inch, slow and deliberate. The man laughed. Ain't no need for dramatics. I'm just here for what's mine. He craned his neck, tried to see past Harlan's shoulder. Girl's got a way of running. Hasn't learned she don't get to choose where she ends up. Oh, God. Get to still. Harlan said nothing. I ain't here to cause trouble, the man added, spitting into the snow. Just want what belongs to me. We had an understanding. She took something that wasn't hers. Figured I'd be decent about it, but if you want to make this something, it don't have to be. The rifle cocked. The man flinched just a fraction. His smile thinned. Fine, he muttered, stepping back. Cold night to be standin' out here anyhow. He turned, crunching across the snow. Before he disappeared into the dark, he called over his shoulder. She, come back, or I'll come collect. Then he was gone. Harlan closed the door, bolted it, and walked to the window. He stood there for a while, not moving, watching the dark like it might shift. Martha hadn't said a word. She sat in the same place still, holding the baby, but her face had changed. Not with fear, but with something colder. Resolve, maybe? Or resignation. After a long time, she whispered, his name's Ketch. Harlan didn't turn. He's not the father. Not of the baby. Just a man I owed once. Her voice caught on that word, owed, as if it disgusted her more than anything else. He helped me after my brother died. Said I could work to repay it. Said a lot of things. But he didn't want labor. The fire popped. Log split down the center. I left when he was passed out, she continued. Took what I needed, just enough to get here. The baby don't belong to him. No one does. Still, Harlan didn't move. Didn't answer. But something in the way he stood, solid, squared, told her he'd heard every word. Later that night, when the baby coughed again and the snow pounded against the cabin walls, Harlan stayed awake with the rifle across his lap. The firelight flickered along the wooden beams above, casting orange shadows like smoke on the ceiling. He didn't speak of protection, didn't offer her promises or words she hadn't asked for, but as the wind howled and the dark pressed in, from all sides, his presence by the door was a silent oath. She would not be handed back. The storm did not pass quickly, thickened, as if the sky itself had grown bitter and decided to hold its grudge a few days longer. Wind scraped along the cabin walls like claws, and the snow pressed against the windows, sealing the three of them inside like bones inside a chest. Days blurred. Time inside the cabin became a soft rhythm of firewood, steam, and breath. Harlan and Martha rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, a gesture to the stove, a nod toward the kettle, a quiet murmur when the baby cried in the dark. But something began to shift beneath the surface of their silence. Something tender and uncertain, like a shoot pushing up through frozen earth. She moved with more confidence now, walking barefoot across the cabin floor with the baby pressed to her shoulder. He noticed how she folded things with care, not just out of habit, but as if caring for things gave her spine purpose. He noticed the way she cleaned the edges of the hearthstones with her fingers, like she was scrubbing something far older than soot. On the fourth morning, after the wind died to a dull hiss, Harlan took her outside. The snow was thick and knee-high, but the sky had cleared enough for work. He handed her the axe without a word, pointed to a stump, and watched. She swung with poor footing and worse grip. The axe bit the wood sideways, useless. He stepped behind her, reached around slowly, not touching her, but guiding her stance. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move away. "Steady," he said, his voice dry from disuse. "Let the weight do the work." She nodded once, tried again. Better. By afternoon, she had split 5 logs, and he let her carry them in while he stayed behind to stack. She returned with a pot of hot water and a cloth for his hands. He accepted it with a glance, nothing more. That evening, the baby coughed again, a thick, rattling sound. Martha dipped a cloth in steam, laid it across his chest. She crushed dried mint from a bundle she'd found in Harlan's stores and boiled it with honey and water. She pressed the cup to the baby's lips with steady fingers. After some time, the cough quieted. He slept against her collarbone, damp with sweat but peaceful. "You did that," Harlan said from the table, surprising them both. She looked up. He was watching the child, not her. She only nodded. Later that night, after the baby had been laid down on a bed of blankets in the corner, Martha brewed strong coffee over the fire. She didn't ask if he wanted any, just poured a second tin cup and brought it to where he sat by the window. He took it with a grunt. They drank in silence. The fire crackled behind them, and the wind outside started to rise again, not like before, but enough to remind them they were not yet free of winter's hold. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "You never asked why I ran." He didn't answer. "I don't mean catch," she added after a long pause. "I mean before him, before the baby." Still he said nothing. She looked down into her cup. "Thank you for not asking." His reply was a quiet sip. Then, after a long stretch, he murmured, "Some questions hurt more than silence." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're good at silence." He didn't deny it. Baby stirred in his sleep. A weak cry, more confusion than need. Harlan moved before she could rise. He crouched beside the blanket pile, rough hands uncertain as he lifted the child. The baby fussed for a moment, then settled into his arms like he'd belonged there all along. Tiny fingers gripped Harlan's coat, clinging. It had been 2 years. 2 years since he'd held a child. His throat tightened. He blinked. His arms stiffened as if bracing for something to break, but nothing did. The child made a soft sound, no louder than a breath, and nestled into his chest. Martha watched from the firelight. She saw the man not as a figure of silence or strength, but as someone who had once broken and hadn't let the pieces go. There were scars on him she couldn't see, but she knew the shape of them. She had her own. She pulled the rocking chair closer, the legs squeaking softly against the floorboards. Her hands were wrapped around her cup now, just for the heat. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The baby sighed. The wind moaned. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. Inside the cabin, something warmer than fire began to fill the room. Not romance, not yet, but something just as difficult, just as brave. He sat in that stillness. A man who'd buried a name, a woman who'd fled hers, and a child too small to know what silence meant. And together, without saying it, they began to learn how to stay. The storm cracked and gave way. Morning rose clear and clean, stretching blue across the horizon with the kind of stillness that only follows violence. The snow lay deep and undisturbed, a white hush over the land. The world looked peaceful, but it wasn't peace, just a pause. Harlan saddled his horse by the barn. The leather creaked, the cinch pulled tight beneath his gloves. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who had done these things alone for too long. But this time, he paused before mounting. Martha stood in the doorway, the baby on her hip. Wrapped in the wool blanket, like it had grown into him. "I'm coming," she said. He didn't argue. They rode in silence, she behind him, the baby between them. The wind bit less than it had days ago, and the sky promised more cold, but no more storms, not today. When they reached the town, the streets were slushed with melt and lined with eyes. Not all the townsfolk stared, but enough did. The general? Store bell clinked as they stepped inside. Martha held the child close and kept her chin lifted. A pair of women near the sacks of flour paused their gossip just long enough to glare. Poor Clara Briggs. One of them whispered loud enough. Gone 2 years, and now her husband plays nursemaid to some girl and her bastard. The other sniffed. Didn't take long for the cabin to fill again. Martha said nothing, but her fingers tightened around the baby. Harlan stood still beside the counter, staring at the clerk, his jaw clenched, muscles ticking in his cheek. He didn't respond, didn't snap. Just stared until the room grew awkward with his silence. They paid in coins and turned to leave. A boy by the doorway tipped his hat to Martha, unsure. No one else did. They rode home slower, not because of snow, just quieter. When they returned, Martha laid the baby down on the folded quilt, kissed his brow, then moved toward the hearth without speaking. Harlan stood nearby, watching her shoulders as they slowly curled in on themselves. She knelt and stoked the fire. Her hands moved with purpose, but something trembled just beneath her skin. Then all at once it broke. She sat back on her heels, covered her face, and wept. Not from shame. Not for the whispers, but for the hollowness of having no one rise to her name. For the long walk through smoke and ash, and the longer walk through silence. For the look in those women's eyes like she had ruined something simply by surviving. Harlan crouched beside her. He didn't speak, just waited until her breathing slowed and her hands dropped from her face. She did not look at him, but she did not move away either. He stood, walked to the far wall, and opened a cedar trunk she had never seen. The hinges groaned as the lid lifted. Inside, wrapped in yellowing linen, was a folded shawl, blue wool, with soft embroidery worn thin from years of touch. Next to it, tucked into the corner like it didn't want to be found, was a small carved baby rattle, the shape of a horse, smoothed at the edges from hands long gone. He brought them to her. She looked at the bundle in his hands, then up at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they held no warning, only offering. He knelt and set them on the floor beside her. It was Clara's, he said, and his. She touched the shawl with trembling fingers. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Her eyes filled again, but she did not cry. She only nodded, like she'd been handed something sacred and didn't know what to do with it. It's not a gift, Harlan said quietly. Just something I kept. And now, maybe it should be seen again. They sat together long after the fire had caught again and roared high in the hearth. The baby slept in his corner, arms flung wide, like he trusted the air not to leave him. The light danced on the walls, orange and gold and soft around the edges. Martha's fingers brushed against Harlan's as they both reached for the same log. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. Their hands stayed close. Not held. Not yet. But close enough that the silence between them warmed. She looked at him then. Truly looked and saw, not the man who had answered her knock, but the man who had stayed awake all night, rifle across his lap. While the wind tried to claw its way in, he looked back and saw not the girl who'd arrived covered in ash, but the woman who had brought life back into a cabin full of ghosts. The fire burned high. And in the flicker, it didn't feel like a place for mourning anymore. It felt, just for a moment, like home. The sun was barely over the ridge when the dust stirred down the trail. Harlan saw it first from the barn, a faint plume against the clean white of snow-covered land. His gut went still, not from fear, just a knowing. Some men bring storms. With them, no matter the weather. By the time the riders reached the gate, Martha had already gathered the baby into her arms. She didn't ask who it was. She just stood straight, jaw set, the child tucked close to her heart. Ketch rode in like he owned something. His coat flapped open, a rifle slung lazy across his back. Beside him were 2 ranch hands from a neighboring spread, men known to keep their boots on both sides of trouble. Behind them, slower, came a 4th man, the Sheriff Lean, an old-eyed, wrapped in a gray duster that had seen better winters. Ketch slid off his horse, boots crunching in the snow. He didn't wait for invitation. "I warned you," he said, voice oily. "Told you she took what wasn't hers. Thought you were just slow to see it, Briggs, but now you're part of it, ain't you?" Harlan stood between him and the door. The sheriff stepped forward, touching his brim. "Harlan," he said quietly, "we've had a complaint. Man claims theft, deception, says there's a child don't rightly belong." No one moved. Ketch turned toward Martha, who'd stepped outside now, the baby on her hip. A quilt wrapped around both their shoulders. "You gonna run again?" Ketch sneered. "Or speak your lies with the law watchin'?" She stared at him, unblinking, pale in the sunlight, but upright. "I'm done running," she said. "Let them judge me. I'll stand." Her voice didn't shake. The sheriff looked from her to Harlan, as if waiting for something more. Harlan's voice came low and certain. "She came in the dead of winter, carrying a child and the fire still on her skin. Didn't ask for pity. Didn't lie to earn comfort. She took nothing that wasn't already lost." Ketch barked a laugh. "That's your story?" But Harlan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his words slow, each one carved. "She kept the child alive when no one else would have. Taught me how to split wood clean again. Has filled this house with more grace than any law ever offered me." His eyes shifted to the sheriff. "That baby has only known her arms. And these walls, you take them apart now, and you break more than law. You break something you can't put back together." The wind whistled through the trees, a cold breath carrying silence in its wake. The sheriff's face was hard to read. He looked to the men with Ketch, then to Martha, then beyond up the hill, where the lone pine stood. He'd been at Clara's burial, had helped dig the hole, knew what the frozen ground does to a man's hands. When he's trying to lay peace where pain lived, his gaze lingered on that hilltop a long while. Then he sighed and spoke. "No law here to serve what's already been redeemed. No crime I see that needs punishing." He looked at Ketch. "Time you rode on." Ketch stepped forward, red-faced, eyes darting between them. "You gonna let her walk, after all, she?" The sheriff raised a hand. It's not threatening, but final. Ketch spit into the snow, then turned. He didn't say another word, just mounted up and rode off. The others followed. When they were gone, the sheriff lingered. "Don't know what you've built here," he said softly, "but maybe it's something worth protecting." Then he left too. Martha stood very still for a long time, the baby shifting against her chest. Harlan didn't speak. Just walked up the hill. She followed at the top, where the snow lay thin beneath the pine's long shadow. Harlan knelt beside the old stones. One had Clara's name, the other only a cross. Both marked by time, both clean of snow. He cleared a patch of ground, set down a braid of dried wildflowers, twisted with his hands the night before. though he hadn't said why. Martha came beside him. She held the baby's hand and lowered it gently to the stone. The child blinked. Up at the light between the branches. "I didn't know her," Martha whispered, "but I feel her here." "She was quiet," Harlan said, "but she'd have listened." They didn't speak for a while. Just sat in the hush. It's the only sound, the creak of trees in the winter air, and the distant call of a crow circling low. When they rode back down the hill, the baby sat between them, bundled in the shawl that once belonged to Clara, eyes half closed against the breeze. Halfway home, Harlan reached for Martha's hand. She let him take it. It wasn't a promise, wasn't anything spoken, but in that space between breath and snow, between the weight of memory and the hush of something new, it was enough. It was something like home.